Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent read for 3 books, although I have a lot to say about them. The first is Femme by Magda Carneci, translated from Romanian by Sean Cotter, the guy who translates Mircea Cartarescu, and indeed this is published by the same American publishers, Deep Vellum. Then we have The Birthday Party by French writer Laurent Mauvignier, translated by Daniel Levin Becker. And from memory, I think this is on the long list for the Booker International. And then finally, Charles Simmons, American author. This is called Wrinkles. So I'm going to start with Femme, a remarkable book, 5 stars, almost certainly will get my top 10 reads of the year. The protagonist, or the character, or the voice that narrates this book describes herself as a tamer version of Scheherazade, in that she's talking to her male lover and she's trying to explain how she works, how she functions, how she sees the world. Now, it's not clear whether this is... She's not trying to change him in that awful way that spouses, one spouse will try and change the other to make them more like them or more like their ideal. It's almost like she's sort of saying, we cannot be together long term unless you understand the type of person I am, or she's actually saying this in the knowledge that it will drive him away. I mean, that's never specified, but it is so sort of extreme and radical a self-presentation, even though she calls herself a tamer Scheherazade. But it's almost like the actual Scheherazade, that if she stops telling these stories and explains the images that are bursting inside her, in the same way as if Scheherazade's run out of stories, that she would die, or at least she would die in relation to this relationship. So what you get are intermixed, when she's directly addressing him, which are the chapters in italics, are sort of sumptuous, delicious, poetic images. She is a poet by trade. This is her only novel. That can be about anything. They can be about smells, they can be about dreams, they can be about childhood memories in that sort of Proustian way. But it's just so beautifully done. I think the writer that she has quite a lot in common with is Clarice Lispector, particularly this book, The Passion According to G.H. But there's a difference which I think makes her more accessible. This is so intense. It's really a draining read. This doesn't have the intensity. It's smoothed and mellowed out by the poetry of the images, I think, even though they're dealing with the same type of representation of the image after image after image, interiority, almost a Jungian presentation. But I don't want to denigrate this by saying it's a sort of psychoanalytical text. It absolutely isn't. It's a poetic, lyrical text, and these images are not Jungian archetypes. They're much deeper and richer than that. So, Lispector, there's a lot of sort of self-hatred in amongst this, whereas this is all really, really sort of positive and love. The word to describe it is love. It's a concept of love, both the love for her partner, but also a love of her place as just one tiny, tiny speck of the cosmos. And I'll come to that more as we go on. The other book it reminds me of is the fellow Romanian author Mircea Cartarescu. I haven't read Solenoid because I can't get hold of it, but I will in time. So all I've read is Blinding. Very similar in that they are sort of, again, this sort of images and mental states exteriorized in words. But again, the difference is here, Carneci's are much more rooted in the body and being a woman in a woman's body, whereas here these have emanated out of the psyche and the imagination and the mind. Some of these do come from her mind in that they're dream images and stuff, but it's much more rooted in her body. And again, for me, that makes it much more coherent, much more sort of rooted as a text, a coherent text, and much more accessible. As I say, it's not got the sort of concussive sort of intensity that Lispector has. So just to give you an example, the slightest thing can set her off, as I say. So this is a childhood memory. For example, the sweet-smelling body of my mother, her aromal body. As a child, I would put on my mother's nightshirt when she was away, and breathing it in, I immediately had her entire body beside me. That certain scent, slightly thick and sweet, a mixture of folliculin and sweat and a bit of cologne, would fill me with such happiness I could faint. I didn't feel the loneliness, separation, rupture, because I had her entire body in my nostrils, and from there I had her in my senses, and from there in my heart and my little mind. To the extent that the body of sense fed me, it was a kind of milk that entered my pores through the air. It settled my hunger and thirst for my mother so I could fall asleep. I had her beside me, with me, in me. But when my father one day said I wasn't allowed to take my mother's shirt to bed, and he told me to be a big girl to grow up, it was a moment of such intense pain that I became instantly conscious. Something snapped within me, an invisible, perfumed umbilical cord. I never forgot this moment. I had to give up the sweet-smelling nightshirt. I gained a moment of presence, a shard of consciousness, but I lost something vital, essential. My mother's enveloping protection was stolen from me. My mother, who was the world, the entire world. So that's a very specific sort of memorised sensation prompted by smell, and there are others that she associates with smell throughout the book. But more interestingly, or not interestingly, more significantly, you have the concept of her mother living inside her in the same way as she blends with other people in various other sort of sections, including her lover, including, former lovers, including dream types that she goes off in chase of in her dreams. There's an amazing description here of the first pricking of her female sense of gender and sexuality. It's prompted by a slightly older boy at a summer camp, but the way it's described is just so beautiful, and it's quite a common theme in literature, but I've not seen it done as well as here. I was totally sucked into, the authenticity and the credibility of, I could almost, go through what she was going through, both mentally, psychologically and physically, as her first arousal, which is completely unrepudiated in the book, but just describing her bodily sense of self, it's just stupendous. So she does have this, this cosmic consciousness that she's always trying to reach out for. And the problem for her with her lover is that he's rational, he's scientific, he's quite dismissive. And that's why she keeps telling him these stories and giving him these images that she can't explain where they arrive from, where they derive from. They're not always prompted by specific things that she sees around her in life and on the street or in the house. Sometimes they just come from nowhere. There's sort of Buddhism, there's a bit of Christian mysticism, because she's reaching out to sort of become part of a universal consciousness. And occasionally she touches it, she reaches it, but then she's snapped back into the reality of, well, she's lying in bed and she hasn't been able to get to sleep, or she's been woken from a dream, or she's just had sex with a lover, or she has to go and eat something. All these sort of mundane, practical things deny her, constantly sort of floating away into this cosmic consciousness. So it's not sort of airy-fairy hippieism at all. It's much more it's much more instructive, I think, for us all to just expand our consciousness, to try and let other things into our minds. She explicitly appeals to her partner in this. Darling, you stare at me in disbelief. Peculiar things like these don't happen to you, or maybe you just won't admit it. You won't let yourself be invaded by inner images, more intense and colourful than the world outside. Your brain isn't home to celestial or monstrous visions of stories you don't understand, that irritate you, obsess you, sometimes even anger you, but that you cannot ignore, because they emanate a force, a magnetism that the exterior world does not have, because they seem to send an essential vital message. Encoded and obscure, it's true, because it is mostly visual. That irritates, that angers. Too many images want to say something important in an unclear and vague manner, instead of making their demands clear, fast, unequivocal. Too many visions as though they fell from the sky or climbed out of the ocean, sending you something like a vibrating effective energy, an overwhelming emotion. Images that want to pull you from yourself, to push you somewhere higher or somewhere else, to raise you to another level of your fragmented, macerated mind, pulled in every direction. Your mind like a computer full of utilitarian peripheral programs that do not speak to each other, that have forgotten their central program and use up heaps of energy. Your shaped, trained mind, formed to face the world in front of you, but never more forgetful of the world inside, ever more incapable of exploring it, understanding it, reconciling itself to it. And then this interior world, like a kind of uncolonised continent full of rare, precious metals that could give access to fabulous energies, to mental bridges that now we can only dream of. This world like a kind of forgotten land, although that is where your roots come from, and perhaps, in the future, your wings. This world like a kind of great nocturnal metropolis, hidden by a wall you cannot see, full of noble palaces and residential neighbourhoods, but also some dangerous places of evil reputation, your interior city of parks and imposing buildings, but also empty lots and garbage pits from which phantoms, monsters and wild beasts sometimes come. This inner world revolts. It wants to be known, recognised, accepted, transfigured, and it sends sumptuous or terrifying images, sends armies of strange, provoking images. It assaults you, it reminds you that it exists, and it has an essential message to send you. And finally, the last bit that I'm going to read. How can I explain all of this to you? You'll laugh at me sardonically. I know you want to give me another long scientific speech, point by point, to drive these bizarre imaginations out of my head. But these images lie hidden in my depths, waiting. They jet forth onto my mental screen when certain neural connections occur, when suffering or joy or unusually intense sensations break certain internal dams. They force a psychic valve to open. They unblock certain canals between my heart and mind. And they hurl a certain kind of vibrating bridge over logic and the rationality, over perceptions and imagination. A bridge, a trampoline, a geyser towards the kingdom of images, situated between the sky and earth, between within and without, between our material world and the subtle cosmic world, through which perhaps the universe wants to express itself, to speak to us, and to be heard and loved. So as I say, she very much feels that this is a force for, sort of expressive of love, a love deeper and wider than just two people's love. It is a cosmic love, that the universe is an expression of love itself. The only negative things, even though she's aware of sort of monsters and some of her dream imagery is unpleasant, the only negative she feels is death, that a lot of this points up to death imagery. But because she feels reconciled to the, as I say, the universality of all beings, of all energy, she feels that, well, death will just part of that process of reabsorbing me into this sort of great sort of mesh of being and of love. I, as you probably sort of picked up from the disdain with which I pronounce the word hippie, I do not hold those values personally. I don't believe in the great oneness of the universe and that we're all connected to it, and that when we die, our energy, because by the laws of physics, energy can't disappear. It remains a constant in terms of its, the amount of energy in the universe. So that, we just reabsorbed into that. I don't believe any of that, but I just found this book wonderful, a wonderful read, beautiful language, beautiful imagery, stunning book. I cannot recommend this highly enough. Just to say, it's quite hard, in the same way as I can't get at the moment the Cartarescu novel Solenoid is out of print. It's sold out its first print run quite quickly, and they're trying to get another one out. I don't know how easy it is to get hold of this book in the UK. I mean, I ordered it, it didn't come for 20 days. I had to chase it up, and then eventually it did come. So I mean, hopefully it is available, because I really, really recommend it. 5 stars. In fact, 5.5 stars, which I can't remember ever giving before. And on to the birthday party. This is wants to be treated, I think, as a literary crime thriller novel. And it has more literary values than most crime novels. It's not a genre novel, because each of the characters involved in here have quite interior monologues, and in that way, I think we get a lot more sense of their character outside of the immediate events of the crime, which I'll describe what that is, which I think does make them sort of more 3D characters than you get in the average crime thriller genre book. The crime itself is Marion is turning 40. She's married to a farmer, even though she's very much a sort of urbanite. They have a daughter called Ida, who is somewhere between 8 and 10, I don't know exactly how old. And Ida and her husband are throwing a very small dinner party to celebrate her 40th birthday. So the first part of this book is sort of the day before and the preparations, but we also learn about the characters. Their next door neighbour is an elderly artist, a refugee from Paris, because the artist hated the scene there. So she just paints to her own sort of agenda without necessarily being bothered about sales and stuff. So they live in neighbouring houses in a hamlet that's composed of just 3 houses, all owned by the farmer who inherited them from his late father. The 3rd house is empty and is for sale. The other 2 guests for the party will be Marion's 2 work colleagues. She works in a print shop in the nearest city or nearest town. And they're going to come after the dinner to share cake, and there are cakes being made by the neighbour. And then 3 men turn up, completely uninvited guests. They are the criminal element of this book, and they sort of hold them hostage without tying them up or anything. They spoil the dinner party, and gradually we realise that Marion is the cause of their appearance. So then we get their sort of backstories and how they interact with Marion. I think the most enjoyable bit of this book for me was before we reached the dinner party, because we learn about how Marion and the farmer, I can't remember his name, it's a fairly loveless marriage. She denies him any kind of intimacy, and that there's a sort of logic to that, and that they seem an ill-matched couple. He has a great sense of inferiority towards his late father's expectations, towards how he looks physically, so he thinks he's landed a real catch in Marion. But she has this strange tattoo on her back, which is a clue to some other previous life. Obviously, she was in the city, now she's come out to the middle of nowhere. So there's some story going on with Marion before these 3 guys, arrive to sort of indicate what it is. So he's aware that he doesn't have the whole picture, but he's so committed to loving her and being in the relationship, even if he can't fulfil her, even if their characters are quite sort of antipathetic to one another. He's hanging on in there. Having said that, when he's going into the town to pick up the cakes and the food and stuff, because he is sexually unfulfilled, he goes off with a prostitute. So I think the characterisations are all very interesting. We get Marion's mystery, we get the husband sort of being unfulfilled. Ida is quite sort of sweet and yet also slightly more worldly wise than she's given credit for. She can feel the tension between her parents, and she's slightly split because she loves them both in different ways. But her greatest love, it seems, is for the next door neighbour, the artist, who she calls Auntie, because every day she comes home from school on the bus, because the father's out in the fields and the mother, Marion, is still working in the print shop or on her way home. She goes to the neighbour's house every afternoon, and the neighbour's teaching her how to draw, and she always sort of has food and drink there and stuff. So I think all of that is perfectly well done, quite charming, even with the sort of the undertone of quite negative stuff for Marion and the husband, a sense of sort of French agricultural life where it's very remote, very cut off. But then the book goes down for me downhill for me when we get the dinner party siege situation. Because a gun is produced, you know that that's going to be used. As Chekhov said, if ever a gun appears on stage, you could expect it to be fired at some point in the drama. Same here. And the ending, I felt, and I'm not going to spoil it, but it just struck me as melodrama. That we had all this sort of interiority, but no, we have to resolve the plot one way or the other. What's going to be the outcome of this siege? Well, whatever it is, it's melodramatic because it involves guns. So I thought that was unsatisfactory. But the biggest thing was, while it took its time in the early part, before the dinner party, I was fine with that. The dinner party siege went on and on and on without us ever really knowing what the game plan was for the bad guys. We know what their motivation of turning up is, and we know sort of what their relationship to Marion is. That is revealed during this siege. But they seem to have turned up and are just sort of waiting. Yes, there's some psychological torture rather than physical torture, but it's never clear really what they expect to achieve once they've turned up. And I found their psychologies, and actually the farmer's psychology, he's very passive in, Ida has pointed out that he's quite, he doesn't show his temper very often, but when he does, it's a fearsome temper. And, what should provoke his ire more than his family being in danger? And he's incredibly passive. Marion has to take all the action, such as it is from their side in the siege, which makes sense because of her sort of hidden past. Maybe she is that type of character. Again, I'm trying not to spoil it for you. But I just thought the siege went on too long. It drifted. Nothing was really happening. It was all sort of backstory as we learn about the relationship of these three guys to Marion, and I didn't think it was very interesting. So yeah, I wasn't convinced by this really. I gave it 3.5 stars, which on Goodreads I rounded up to 4, but it could have quite just as easily be rounded down to 3. And finally to Charles Simmons, Wrinkles. This was written in mid-1970s, and I love the elegant structure of this book. It's so simple and so effective. The protagonist, who may be Charles Simmons, it might be quite auto-fiction, I don't know. Lots of chapters, they are each restricted to 4 pages. There's a couple of 3 pages and one that's 5 pages just because of the sort of print layout. But these very short pages where he considers something as a child, and then for 3 pages how it keeps the motif or the emblem or what he's discussing, how he kept sort of re-encountering it. And then the last page, the 4th page, is how it's manifested in adulthood, and finally to when he's an old man looking back. And every single chapter is done like that. And it's so beautifully symmetrical, beautifully structured, and beautifully written in parts. I mean, the first one is about his relationship to numbers, how he taught himself to count, how he learned to write numbers, and it goes into sort of quite a lot of detail about each of the individual digits, 1 to 9, learning to write them. And then he realised that if you can write them, then you can write any single number up to infinity. And then it ends, and this isn't a spoiler because, as I say, this is the first one. He realises that the number that mid-80s, 84, 85, 86, keeps cropping up in his life. This will be a relief to him. In his 60s, he will wonder if the reoccurrence of numbers in the mid-80s in his history will apply to the end of his life, i.e. that he'll die in his mid-80s. So, things under consideration: his attitude towards truth and lies, his attitude towards solitude, the sort of repressed, or not the sublimated ideal woman, which he realises when his mother is dying, and he says that he had a thing for his nursemaid. She says, "Oh yeah, I knew that. Your wife looks like that nursemaid," which he never realised, because often, we don't know our ideal types. We don't recognise them as a conscious thing, how we're drawn to them. So, his attitudes towards alcohol, just all sorts of things are treated from childhood as he first experiences them, how their significance in their reoccurrence, although they might have changed, as I say, through adulthood, his time in the army, through to old age. He's not a particularly likeable character. He divorces his wife, he's not a great parent, he's quite free and easy about lying. He seems to have a sort of commitment problem where he has these ideas and he doesn't follow through with them, either because the moment has passed, the sort of the moment of inspiration or incitement has passed, or he has some sort of strange moral, ethical prohibition to taking that course of action, where he's built up to, no, that is the course of action he wants to take, and then something turns him off it. I just think this is wonderfully done. Very simple. It is 70s in its representation of issues around gender and sexuality, so you would have to forgive it that. But I think it's definitely a worthwhile read because of its simplicity, sort of simple elegance, really. And it's an interesting story about the individual portrayed here. 5 stars. And onto what I'm about to start reading. This is Argentinian author Roberto Alt, The Seven Madmen and the Flamethrowers, which I assume are 2 different novels, translated by Naomi Lindstrom and Larry Riley. And this is probably going to be the first of 3 Latin American novels I'm going to read in the month of April. I'm going to read I Am the Supreme, or I Supremo, which is a Paraguayan novel, and also an Argentinian novel, something like Tombs and Graves. I'll put them in the show notes, what they are. I really should have brought them with to hold up to camera. Anyway, so that's this week's recent reads. Till next time, thanks very much.